for everyone who participated in this book, the driving force was wanting their stories to mean something, wanting their trials and tribulations to serve a higher purpose. My hope with any piece of investigative journalism that I do is to raise awareness of an injustice that's going on in the hopes that it can help lead eventually to change.
Welcome to the Nieman Storyboard podcast, where we dig into the craft of journalism and storytelling. I'm Mark Armstrong, editor of Nieman Storyboard. This show is brought to you by the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. You can get updates by signing up for our newsletter. Just go to niemanstoryboard.org to sign up. Today I'm excited to welcome journalist and Pulitzer finalist Shoshana Walter. She's an investigative reporter for the Marshall Project covering public health and criminal justice, and she's the author of the book Rehab, An American Scandal, which was published last year and has just been released in paperback. Her book tells the story of 4 different people whose lives or work have been impacted by addiction treatment in the U.S. It shines a light on a system where private treatment centers have little oversight, leading to potential mistreatment, exploitation, and corruption. We talked about her approach to investigative reporting and how journalists can report on addiction and recovery with care, particularly when it comes to covering marginalized communities. Over the last several years, Walter has reported a series of stories for the Marshall Project, Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting, and the New York Times Magazine on pregnant women who have had their children taken away after false positive drug tests or after taking doctor-prescribed medications to treat opioid addiction. In response to Walter's reporting, multiple states passed new laws, and the state of New Jersey announced in July that it was instituting major reforms to its drug testing policies for pregnant patients. Walter was also the lead reporter and producer on the acclaimed investigative podcast American Rehab. So without further ado, here's my conversation with Shoshana Walter. Shoshana, it's great to have you here.
It's so great to be here, Mark. Thanks so much.
I want to just go all the way back here. So your work across the Marshall Project, your book Rehab, which was published last year, and podcasts like American Rehab cover the intersection of public health and the criminal justice system. Where does this beat and this story begin for you as a journalist, and what sent you down this specific path?
Yeah, I think it really began when I was at Reveal from the Center for Investigative Reporting about 9 years ago. I've always covered the criminal justice system to some extent. That's how I started as a reporter, as a night shift cops reporter at a local paper. And when I was at Reveal, I was covering criminal justice, but just that one year, my editor came to me and said, we just got a grant to cover state courts. And so I need you to find an investigative story on state courts, whatever it is, who knows. But I was really curious, how they actually operate, where people are getting sent for treatment. I knew there was a treatment shortage. This is kind of towards the beginning, middle of the opioid epidemic. So I ended up taking a look at drug treatment programs. And I just happened to stumble across this program that was being utilized by courts throughout Oklahoma and Arkansas that had been founded by a former poultry industry executive and was sending defendants to work without pay at for-profit chicken processing plants, where they were making chicken products for KFC and Walmart and Popeyes and Rachel Ray Nutrish. And it just kind of opened the door to a topic that I had no idea even existed, this idea of uncompensated labor being a form of rehabilitative treatment. And I ended up teaming up with a reporting partner, Amy Julia Harris, who remains a great friend to this day. And we wrote a series of stories about these types of programs all over the United States. We ended up doing a podcast about it. And, it made me really curious about if, this is something that a lot of people consider treatment, if judges and high-powered court officials and lawmakers believe that unpaid labor is a form of treatment in this day and age in the United States, then what does the rest of our treatment landscape look like? And that's what led to the book, Rehab, An American Scandal.
Maybe you could tell me a little bit about, those early days of just beginning to get this assignment and where you started and what kind of support you had from the team at Reveal as you started to look into this.
Yeah, I mean, find an investigative story related to state courts. It's such a huge topic. What direction do you go in? And the way I started was basically just doing as much reading as I could on stories related to state courts. What kind of investigative stories had been done, what had not been done. And I think that's how I ended up deciding to focus a little bit on drug and diversion courts. I knew there had been a lot written about drug courts and diversion courts, but most of it had been very glowing. And it seemed like there was a lot of unexplored territory there. I think a lot of the stories that I've done have kind of looked at the unintended negative consequences of sometimes well-intentioned policy decisions. And I think drug and diversion courts are kind of fall under that category. There were some circumstances that made me want to look at that too. Like, I knew that we were in this opioid epidemic. I knew that most people who needed treatment couldn't get it. I knew that a lot of treatment programs were 12-step based, not necessarily incorporating medications that are known to help people recover from addiction. I had, legitimate questions about, where people are going for treatment, how courts evaluate who goes where for treatment. And, in my early preliminary conversations related to those questions, I started hearing a bit about faith-based programs that a lot of courts were using. And in one program in particular, which I won't name because I didn't end up writing about it, but or investigating it thoroughly enough to report on it now. But, I heard about this one very large Christian-based program that courts all over the country were utilizing. They still are, to my knowledge. And that opened the door to questions about, what happens if you don't belong to that faith when you enter this treatment program, and how does the religious content of this program dictate the treatment that people are actually getting? And with any investigative story, one of the biggest questions is, how am I going to measure the scope of this problem? Like, how do I even know it's a problem to begin with? And so I started looking for sources of data. And courts are tricky because every state runs their court system very differently. Sometimes it's run very differently, in each county. So I began by looking for states with court systems that I could utilize to find the data to answer this question. I stumbled across Oklahoma, which actually does have this unified court database where you can scrape it, you can search it, you could analyze it in any number of ways. And at the time, I was really curious about this one particular program. So I just used advanced Google search. I mean, I'm sure there are now AI techniques that would make this a lot easier, but I just used advanced Google search to look through the entirety of the state courts database for mentions in court dockets of this one particular program. And out popped all these court cases where people were ordered into the program. And then I just started experimenting. Okay, like, how many other programs have the word Christian in them? I started throwing in other names of other religions to see if there were other faith-based programs that I hadn't identified yet. And that's how I stumbled across this program called Christian Alcoholics and Addicts in Recovery. And when I did just a little bit of digging about this program, I learned it had been founded by this former poultry industry executive, a VP at a major company, and the main form of treatment that men were getting in this program was unpaid labor at chicken processing plants.
Wow. So in this case, this wasn't even public records requests. This was a database. It was already digitized and readily accessible to you.
Yeah, exactly. I basically searched through all of the court dockets to see how often this one particular rehab name had been mentioned. And that's also how we initially found a lot of the sources for our story.
Yeah, so tell me about the sources and sort of the order of events and who you speak to first.
Yeah, I think the first step with that story was looking up previous news articles to see what had been written about it. And again, very, very glowing news articles that did not make any mention of the unpaid labor aspect. And I went to the program's Facebook page where people had left reviews, some positive, some negative. And I think by this time, Amy, Julia, and I were working together on this. So we both started reaching out to people who had left both positive and negative reviews to find out, what did this program consist of? Mm-hmm. And another thing that we did very early on actually was contact the program itself. That's something I really like to do and try to do whenever I can when I'm working on a story. Approach the subject of the story as soon as possible.
That's interesting because just from what I hear about investigative stories, there's always, sometimes like a strategy to how and when you go forward. If there's someone being accused of something, like that's not what I would expect in that situation. So why would you do that? Yeah,
well, you can't do it with every single story. There are definitely some where you can't do that. But, for this particular story and for many stories that I work on, I like to approach the reporting process from a place of genuine curiosity. It's easier and often leads to more fruitful conversations with the subject of your story if you can approach them without really knowing that much about them, about their motivations, about what you're writing about. So we contacted the founder of the program very early on in the reporting process. And I think it was very eye-opening to hear from her directly what her program consisted of, what she didn't mention, what she did mention, what she chose to emphasize. And it opened the door to further communication. So then throughout the rest of the reporting process, we had this open door to her. She actually responded to our calls and our emails. And when we finally got to the point of having, our findings and wanting to go through every single aspect with her, she actually invited us to visit the program, to tour the program, and to sit down with them and a number of their participants. And so I think it made the story richer, and it allowed us to answer some questions we weren't able to answer, and it allowed us to include her perspective, which is, I think, very important.
Mm-hmm. What was the response to the series when it was published, and what kind of feedback did you get?
I remember the reaction being pretty large at the time. And I think that part of the reason why people cared so much is because these individuals were manufacturing food products that so many Americans consume. Mm-hmm. And so people were unnerved to find out that unpaid laborers were behind their chicken wings from Popeyes or Rachel Ray Nutrish pet food brand. I mean, her PR representative was really upset to hear from me and that I was questioning Rachel Ray's use of uncompensated laborers. And it really got under people's skin.
I guess you said this was sort of the beginning of the reporting that eventually leads to your book, Rehab. What is the timeline for that, and how did you decide this could be a book?
Yeah, I had an agent at the time, or someone I had been talking to as my agent for a few years by the time these stories came out. And time to time would check in with him and chat about ideas that he or I had for something that I could write a book about. And there just wasn't anything that we had yet discussed that I felt like was really worthy of spending so much time digging into. One big piece of advice that I got while working on the book, or prior to working on the book, was, don't do it if you're going to be sick of it in a year or two's time, because it's going to take a really, really long time and you're going to be sick of it by the end. So I just hadn't found anything yet that seemed really worthy of that kind of time investment. Mm-hmm. And then, we worked on these stories and I felt like there was this bigger story to tell. The opioid epidemic has brought a lot of changes to the national conversation on addiction. And a lot of positive changes. When I first started working as a reporter, there was really very little interest in reporting on drugs or people who were addicted to substances. But over the course of this, initial 10 years of the epidemic, the conversation had really changed. And now lawmakers were talking about addicted people as having a disease. And a lot of people considered them victims of pharmaceutical companies that had preyed upon them. Lawmakers were talking about solutions. And one of the biggest solutions that lawmakers continually pointed to was this idea of treatment. And the country did enormously expand our treatment system as a result of this. But from what I was seeing with all these treatment programs that we were reporting on, it wasn't always working. In fact, in some ways, it made people a lot worse. And so I saw a much bigger story about the entirety of the system. What we've been thinking of as the solution to this huge public health problem is maybe not working the way that it should in order to actually help people come out of this crisis. And so then I began working with my agent on a proposal. I spent probably a year kind of learning as much as I could about the treatment landscape, what it looks like, what it's composed of, identifying the major problems with it, identifying another character for the book. And then I wrote the proposal, and probably about a year or two later, I sold the book.
And what year was this? So how long ago was the proposal first came together?
I sold the book proposal in 2019, and then COVID hit, and so things the timeline changed a bit. I continued at Reveal working on stories related to rehab work camps, and we did this podcast called American Rehab that came out at the very beginning of COVID. And then that also coincided with me being pregnant. I sold the book proposal, gave birth, and then and then COVID hit, and I began a year of first family leave and then book leave.
That's a lot.
I like to call myself a delusional optimist. I did not understand what I was signing myself up for with all of these things at once. And of course, we did not know what was coming with COVID. But yeah, during that first year, a lot changed for my plans for this book. Initially I had been thinking about making it a bit more immersive, and I had been following unhoused people in Oakland who were struggling with addiction. And then with COVID, we all went into lockdown. In fact, we relocated to move in with my in-laws for some extra support. And I realized I had to completely change my approach to the reporting process for the book.
Obviously, so much more reporting has to happen virtually, but what changed in terms of your exact tactics and maybe with your structure and your sources?
Yeah, well, I switched to focusing more on reconstructed narrative. And, I had one of the individuals already in mind, Chris Kuhn. He was someone that we focused on in our podcast, American Rehab, who went through one of these rehab work camp programs. So I was already in touch with and communicating with. Dr. Marina Leigh, I met him when I was working on the proposal. He was one of the first Suboxone prescribers in the United States, an addiction medicine doctor who ended up getting arrested by the Drug Enforcement Administration for providing this treatment to his patients.
And that is specifically the drug opioid abuse, correct?
Exactly, yes. Okay. Suboxone, one of the gold standard medications for treating opioid addiction. And then I started looking for a couple other people who I wanted to help me tell the story of other aspects of our treatment system. One of the main aspects that I really wanted to cover, that I felt newly inspired to cover, in part because of my own pregnancy and childbirth experience, was the experience specifically of mothers who are struggling with addiction. There's kind of like two different ways that we have typically treated people struggling with addiction. One is through the criminal justice system, and the other way is through the child welfare system. And this also influenced my reporting when I came back from book leave back to Reveal. It kind of led me down this path of reporting on mothers specifically. But I knew I wanted to find a mother who could help me tell that story of how we have failed, in particular failed women of color struggling with addiction, mothers struggling with addiction in this country for decades. I just started reaching out to law firms that specialize in child welfare cases, to advocacy groups that organize parents who have children in foster care. And that's how I met April Leigh, one of the main narrative through lines of my book, who was working at the time at this law firm, kind of as like a peer advocate for other mothers with child welfare cases. Initially, I met with her and another lawyer at the firm and just asked some basic questions, but I could see that April just had such a compelling story to tell, that she was such a powerful storyteller in her own right. And when I approached her about doing this, she was very interested. So we ended up, all of the individuals in my book, we talked for hours and hours every week over the phone, sometimes on video, for years. And then finally, when COVID lifted a bit, I was able to go and visit April in person a couple of times, and that really benefited the book as well. But yeah, I would say we established some pretty intimate relationships over the phone during these early years of COVID.
And in the case of April, and you mentioned reconstructed narrative, so you're looking back through her life with her, and she is, in a good place at the time that you're meeting with her. So tell me a little bit about the dynamics.
Yeah, going into this, I knew I needed to find individuals who were in stable enough places to be reporting partners and reporting out their own stories, accessing the materials that I need to access in order to verify their stories. All of the records, all of the archival materials. I also had just had this experience of following unhoused people in Oakland, seeing many of them disappear or get hurt. And I realized that, to write this book, I really needed to be in long-term communication with the individuals I was writing about. And they needed to be in stable enough places to be able to withstand the difficulty of covering really upsetting aspects of their lives. With stories that I've done before previously, too, I had experiences of interviewing people in active addiction, and it just always felt ethically dubious to be documenting behavior that was influenced by whatever substance this person was on, behavior that they might not ordinarily consent to me documenting. I'm there, I'm a fly on the wall, but they're not in a condition really to be able to advocate for or protect themselves from my documenting their experiences. And I think too, as a journalist, I'm in this position of power and authority in a way. I'm the one who is shaping the story. I'm taking everything that you're giving me and I'm deciding what to use and how to use it. Even with someone who is in recovery, who's not in active addiction, you still need to take care with those sources and ensure that you're starting that relationship from a position of trust. And so I learned a lot, honestly, working on this book about working with marginalized sources, about taking that kind of care. Now, whenever I enter that first conversation with someone who's gone through something really traumatic, I approach it almost like I'm trying to talk them out of agreeing to the story. I start from a place of total transparency. This is what the reporting process is going to look like. It's going to be really long and it's going to be very intrusive. And I'm going to ask you really nosy questions. And we're going to cover really traumatic moments in your life. And we may have to cover those moments multiple times. And by the end of it, you're going to be sick of me. You won't want to talk to me again. But I find that starting from that place of total transparency, it provides this person with the opportunity to make an informed decision about whether or not they actually want to participate in this process, to ask questions, to raise concerns. I find, too, that it helps them feel more confident in my abilities as a journalist, that I have a sense that I know what I'm doing, I know what it entails. You enter into these relationships with sources if you don't explain up front, they don't know what they're getting themselves into. And so it can start to feel very overwhelming.
Yeah.
They don't want to deal with it. It was upsetting. So they just, disappear. Or something really busy is going on in their lives, And so that's the approach that I learned to take while reporting on the book. And that has now become my main approach to working with marginalized sources.
I'm interested in sort of, as you've got the 4 characters in your book, once you sort of lay out this and once you try and talk them out of it, what is the thing that ultimately still drives them to say, yes, absolutely, I still want to do this?
I think for everyone who participated in this book, the driving force was wanting their stories to mean something, wanting their trials and tribulations to serve a higher purpose. I explained to them, too, why I was doing the book. My hope with any piece of investigative journalism that I do is to raise awareness of an injustice that's going on in the hopes that it can help lead eventually to change. And I think that is something that all 4 individuals in my book really wanted to see. And they were all incredible reporting partners in reporting their stories. April, one of the reasons why I was really drawn to April too was that she kept diaries during the entirety of her active addiction. She's a really powerful writer. She writes poetry. She writes letters. She had all of this material from when she was struggling with her addiction, when she was struggling with the separation from her children, that allowed me to gain insight into what that experience was like for her at the time. And Larry Leigh, he had access to the entirety of his DEA case file, which is not something you can get via a FOIA request, all of the undercover body camera footage. So I was able to really see what that investigation entailed and what it was like, how undercover agents treated patients at the clinic, the kinds of questions that they were asking, how they mischaracterized addiction medicine completely in many of the ways that they were approaching that investigation. So all of these individuals had access to materials in addition to their memories that allowed me to tell really compelling stories about experiences that they had in the past.
I was wondering if you could read a passage from it, and maybe something that illustrates what we were talking about around the reconstructed narrative.
Yeah, sure. This is one of April's chapters, kind of like an epiphany moment for her when she realizes that she doesn't want to be using anymore after her children were removed from her care. While Chris Kuhn wondered where the hell he was going, April Leigh woke up flat on the floor and wondered where she had ended up. She squinted her eyes to survey the room. Her cheek was pressed against a matted green carpet. On the bed there was a floral bedspread pockmarked with cigarette burns, and a dusting of white powder lined the floor, boric acid to kill the roaches. She remembered. The Blue Moon Hotel. April's last memory was of her shooting dope. Then things went black, and now she realized she had probably overdosed. She didn't know what time it was. That wasn't something she usually thought to notice, except she could tell through the windows that it was night. The light was on, casting a sour glow across the cracks in the ceiling and on the itchy rent-by-the-hour sheets. April picked herself up from the floor and walked to the full-length mirror across from the bed. It had been a long time since she'd looked at her reflection. It hadn't occurred to her to look, even when the men who picked her up on the track had started calling her slim. In her mind, April was almond eyes and high cheekbones and dark chocolate skin. She had been all hips and thighs and wide shoulders and long legs. She'd pretty much looked this way since she was 10 years old. Back then, she'd sneak out with some of her grandmom's Newports and go down to the overgrown ravine by the train tracks, praying the cigarettes would stunt her growth. Now she was 26 years old, and she looked skeletal. Her collarbone jutted out. She had no thighs or breasts. Only the stretch marks from bearing her 3 children remained, a testament to her former life etched across her stomach. Early in the day, April had been taking a break on the steps of the Blue Moon Hotel when another girl sat down next to her and asked to bum a cigarette. She was close to a friend as April had these days, even though as a heroin user she was the odd one on the track, where almost everyone else used crack. On this day, the girl confided to April that she had AIDS. "Do you use protection?" April asked. With a shrug, the girl said she didn't. Then she stamped out her cigarette and answered a call from a nearby car. April sat in silence and let sink in what the girl had just said. She had AIDS. She didn't use protection. These Johns had become almost as familiar as the pack of Newports in her purse. Many of them she saw more regularly than members of her own family. The girls bounced back and forth between them. April had serviced their customers, and they had serviced hers. And of course, this girl didn't use protection. Most of the time, neither did April. It wasn't a smart thing to do, but when that sickening feeling of withdrawal starts to creep across your skin, nothing stands in the way of $100, including a condom. April felt like throwing up. Her mother had died of AIDS in 2002 after selling sex for years to pay for her crack cocaine habit. April had been 15 and pregnant when her mother showed up at her door, a sickly version of her former self. April had tended to her mother in her final days, stolen a wheelchair from outside the emergency room to cart her around, bought her weed to ease her pain, then crawled into bed and giggled and cried with her until she went to the hospital to die. Her mother had told her then that she wasn't worried about April. "You are going to survive," her mother told her. April surveyed her body in this room at the Blue Moon Hotel. "Will I?"
Thank you for sharing that. Tell me about the reporting of that scene.
Yeah, a lot of the conversations that April and I had over these many years, we would get on the phone and be on the phone for hours. April would she's such an amazing storyteller, and she would, when I did finally meet her in person and we had this interviewing experience in person, I could see her just going into her own mind, almost like I wasn't even there at times. And she would just talk and mine her memory to take herself back to that moment in time. I think that is something that has become really important for her in her recovery, is reminding herself of these places that she has been and the experiences that she has survived. And so I remember we went over this scene multiple times, and so multiple times we had these really long, emotional, extensive conversations where she was bringing herself back to that moment. And then, she had journal entries from that time period that she shared with me. I went and got building department records so I could see the inspections that had been done of this hotel to fact check her recollection of what it looked like. The boric acid, the roaches, the floral bed sheets. There were a lot of different sources that kind of came together to build that fuller picture.
And then when you're having these long conversations with April, are you going in with sort of, today we're going to talk about this period of your life, or was it pretty free flowing?
I think initially we just kind of went from beginning to end. We started just getting to know each other, and I would ask her the most basic of questions to just hear her broader story. The book is about her experience, but it's also a little bit about what her experience represents. And so after going through the entirety of her story, I then, looked at all of that material that I'd gathered and pulled out the scenes and the experiences that really were important touchstones for the book. And then went back to April and interviewed her again about those specific scenes to get as much narrative detail as possible. And also interviewed her family, her friends, people she'd been unhoused with living on the streets of Kensington to kind of paint that bigger picture.
And had you always had it in mind that there would be 4 main characters with the book and that it would be weaving them together?
Yeah. When I sold the book proposal, I only had 2 of these people in hand. But I knew going into it that I wanted to find 2 other individuals. I wanted the book to explore this really difficult, dense policy topic of addiction treatment. I knew I had a lot of ground to cover, a lot of spinach to include. But I didn't want readers to be bored. I wanted them to get excited about the book. I wanted there to be suspense in the book and drama in the book. And so I thought that the best way to accomplish that was by weaving this dense policy story through the narratives of these 4 individuals and then interspersing them throughout.
Mm-hmm. I want to jump to sort of post-publication. This continues to be an area of focus, and I want to talk about your latest series that you've reported on, which is around false positive drug tests from women who are expecting. How did you get into that?
Yeah, before I found April, I had been learning more about the experiences of women struggling with addiction, women in recovery. And one thing that I was really shocked to learn is that child welfare courts had removed children from women who took medication-assisted treatment during their pregnancies. And medication-assisted treatment meaning Suboxone, buprenorphine, methadone, these addiction treatment medications that have been proven to reduce overdose deaths by more than 50%. Every leading public health authority in the country advises pregnant women to take these medications if they're struggling with addiction. This is considered the gold standard of addiction treatment for pregnant people, for really anyone who's struggling with opioid addiction. And so when I learned that there had been judges who terminated the parental rights of mothers who took this medication, I was really shocked by that. I ended up doing this radio hour for Reveal and a story for the New York Times Magazine about this phenomenon of women who take medication-assisted treatment during their pregnancies as advised by their doctors, every leading public health authority in the nation, and then end up getting reported to CPS and having their children taken away. And, we tried to quantify the problem by collecting data from a number of different states. We found this had happened to thousands of women. And over the course of reporting that story, I learned the mechanisms through which this happens. Oftentimes women are identified when they go in to give birth as potential substance users through these drug tests. And most often hospitals are using urine drug screens that are super fast and super cheap, but have false positive rates as high as 50% and are extremely easy to misinterpret. And so after doing this story on women taking medication-assisted treatments, I ended up focusing on hospital drug testing policies and found a whole host of problems with how hospitals are identifying alleged drug users and then reporting them to both child welfare and to the police over positive drug tests.
How do you think about how you're addressing each next story and advancing the sort of broader question of what's happening in this situation?
The first story that I did for the New York Times Magazine, I really wanted it to be a narrative. There are very few groups in the United States that are more demonized than women who use drugs, particularly women who use drugs during pregnancy, particularly women of color who use drugs. Mm-hmm. There's a whole history during the crack cocaine epidemic of demonizing Black women who used crack during pregnancy. This idea that their quote-unquote crack babies would become a drain on the system, were destined to be super predators. And this kind of demonization of Black women during that time led to some laws that continue to have harmful consequences for birthing people in the United States. During the 80s and 90s is when we really started to see substance use during pregnancy classified as child abuse and neglect. And that's not only led to women getting separated from their children and incarcerated, but it's helped establish fetal personhood in numerous states and has reduced reproductive rights in many states. So these policy changes can have, decades-long repercussions. For that story, I didn't want people to read it and just dismiss it because it's about a woman who used drugs. I really wanted people to have an understanding of how difficult it is to recover in the United States and all the odds that are stacked against you when you're a pregnant person of color who is trying to recover. And so I ended up focusing that New York Times Magazine story on Jade Doss, who's pictured here behind me. She was a woman who gave birth in Arizona several years ago. She was struggling with homelessness. She was taking Suboxone throughout her entire pregnancy. And then when she gave birth, she was reported to CPS because of the Suboxone prescription, and they took her baby. And a lot of other things happened in between. Jade desperately wanted to be a mom. She so badly wanted to be a mom. And ultimately, she and her boyfriend at the time, the father of the child, ended up fleeing with their newborn, and kind of led police on like a multi-state chase throughout numerous states. They basically went on a family road trip. They didn't know they were being pursued by law enforcement. Yeah. They just were trying to start their lives as a family. And ultimately, police caught up to them and arrested Jade and the father of her child and separated her from her child again. And sadly, even though Jade remained sober that entire time, she was taking Suboxone that entire time, she never was able to get her child back. I tried to tell Jade's story very honestly, but also, really tried to paint a picture of this person who so desperately desired to be a mother, but never really got the chance to be the mother that she could have been, because she never got a chance to actually take care of her child. So that was the approach that I took with that first story. And then with the drug testing stories, I wanted to really prove how widespread this issue is. And so I went to every single state across the country and tried to determine if there are any states that require hospitals to take safeguards when it comes to drug testing. There are very well-established safeguards for workplace drug testing, for example. Like if you are drug tested in the workplace, depending on where you live, you're likely entitled to a second, more precise confirmation test and a review from a specially trained doctor who can differentiate between a positive test triggered by a medication or poppy seeds versus illicit heroin. But what I found in doing that initial story is that there was not a single state at the time, that's since changed, but there was not a single state that required those same protections for birthing people. So women were have been going into hospitals to give birth. They're being subjected to drug tests they don't know about, and then they're being reported to authorities over false positive tests. And I found women all over the country who literally were separated from their children because of positive tests triggered by poppy seeds or by labetalol, one of the most commonly prescribed blood pressure medications for pregnant women. That can cause false positives for meth and for fentanyl. And there were a number of women who were put under investigation or separated from their children because of medications that the hospital itself gave them during child labor. So, in many women who receive epidurals, they receive fentanyl in their epidurals. That can trigger a positive test for fentanyl. There are very common medications that women get during C-sections that can trigger false positives for meth. And so this is happening all the time, and there are no laws or policies in place to actually prevent a woman who gives birth from being reported to authorities over a false test.
This leads to my sort of a bigger existential question for you about what drives you in your work and what keeps you motivated to continue to follow these stories and build on the work.
When I first started reporting, I mentioned I was a night shift cops reporter at a daily newspaper in Florida. And I entered that job not really wanting that job. The idea of covering cops and crime did not really appeal to me. But as soon as I started, my mind was blown because there are so many injustices that occur in our criminal justice system, like alligators eating men who waded into lakes, or my very first crime scene that I ever visited, that ended up being a 3-part narrative series. This 13-year-old kid got into an after-school fight with another middle school student, and he took out a knife. The other kid died. And then this 13-year-old was charged as an adult and put in an adult jail, facing a charge of murder. And I remember at the time just being shocked that a child would be placed in an adult jail and be facing life in prison for a very, very tragic mistake. And no one around me from the area seemed shocked in any way by this, because this is just normal. But as an outsider, I was really surprised by it and felt like it needed to be written about. And I think that is the perspective that often draws me to stories. It's something that I am surprised by. People are getting harmed, and that's just always what motivates me, is, something I wasn't expecting that is hurting people, and I should write about it so that other people can see it this way too. Prior to pregnancy, I had never thought about writing about pregnancy or about motherhood. In fact, I had kind of avoided such stories because I felt worried that I would be perceived as biased in some way, being a woman. This is kind of the mentality that I went into my reporting career with. After George Floyd, there was this supposed reckoning within journalism, and this feeling that a lot of people embrace, that lived experiences actually are essential to journalism, essential to reaching communities that are underserved by journalism. When I finally did have that experience of being pregnant and entering motherhood, I realized that my own personal experiences were a reporting asset, and it gave me a perspective that a lot of people don't have, and that's why these stories aren't getting told. So I took a lot of inspiration from that moment in journalism that now feels, unfortunately and infuriatingly, somewhat behind us.
Yeah. What advice would you have for emerging journalists right now in terms of how to think about their work?
When I entered journalism, it felt like a hard time. I remember my first year, 40 people were laid off, more than half the newsroom. But now it's even harder. All these established media organizations are struggling, and there's so few jobs available. Don't let anyone deflate your ambition. If you have an idea of journalism that you want to do, try to find time, make time to do it. I think oftentimes young journalists are told to pay their dues, and that's true. You have to start somewhere, right? But also know, have confidence that you have a particular perspective you can bring to your reporting, and you should follow that instinct and really pursue stories that are compelling to you.
That's great. Shoshana, thank you again for being here today.
Thanks so much for having me, Mark. It was fun.
Thanks again to Shoshana and to all of you for listening. If you like what we're doing with Nieman Storyboard, leave us a written review and a rating in Apple Podcasts or Spotify. You can also share this podcast with a friend. We'll see you soon.